So then, this is part 2 of my little review of At the Shrugged. Now that I've actually finished the book, I can give a lot more insight into it. But before I do, I figure if you made it this far, might as well give a brief summary of part 3. Okay, so if I remember correctly, I left off with Dagny saying that she was following the destroyer. Well, the method of pursuit is rather interesting. She apparently was able to commandeer a plane due to her quick tongue and just the general state of affairs of everybody working these days. This one really took me by surprise because she's a woman of the railroad, and this is the first time we've had any mention of her being able to fly. But I guess that's just a minor critique. Follows the destroyer into the depths of the Colorado Rockies, when all of a sudden, the plane she's pursuing disappears. So she decides to investigate. She tries her best to look throughout the Rockies to figure out where this plane might have went. Maybe it went down, maybe there was a secret landing pad or something. She's circling around. All of a sudden she notices that she gets lower and lower, and all of a sudden she can see a valley revealed at the very bottom of the mountains. This is when the engine fails, and as she is going down, her final words are, "Who the hell is John Galt?" Now, I should probably give a little context before I go a little further. So the very first words of the book are, "Who is John Galt?" Throughout the book, he is probably the major mystery. He is considered an explorer, a great inventor, and the person that stopped the motor of the world. Every so often, there's other people that have their own stories, other people with different insight, but we never really get a full picture because it doesn't seem like it could be just one person. However, when Dagny awakes at the bottom of the valley, she is greeted with the man, the myth, the legend, John Galt. They're not really sure how to believe each other's interaction. John Galt being in a valley that he thought was secure to the outside world, and Dagny being in a place she could only dream of. They stare at each other for a little bit when he introduces himself. She then starts asking questions. Are all these stories actually true? To which he says, yes. All of them. He's a great inventor. He was the one that invented the static motor that Dagny found in the 20th Century Motor Company. He was the man who founded this valley. Now, the basic gist of this valley is that all the industrialists of the world, say Wyatt, Danager, and all these other great industrialists, this is where they disappeared to. This is where they made their lodging. Now, what is rather fascinating about this is that when I got into this section of the book, that is when I picked up this copy of We the Living, which was the author's very first book. Now, as common practice at the time, there is a little inscription on the inside basically saying other works that this author have done, as well as a brief summary of what each book is about. The very first one here is an entry for At the Shrugged. I'll read aloud. The great bestseller that tells the story of what happens to the world when the men of the mind, the men of ability, go on strike. I found it kind of crazy that I could have bought that book for $1.50 when it took me $5 to get this big one. Of course, that's 1960s money. But the crazy thing is, that's how John Galt explains this valley. This is where the great industrialists of the world are on strike. The basic mentality is that they've had enough of just constantly working, and the harder they work, the harder they're told to work. And there is no reward for it whatsoever. So, they're waiting here until people realize that they're actually needed in the world. And it's starting to get to the point in the book where they are needed because basically Dagny and Hank are the only ones left that can actually do anything. Everybody else is idiots just trying to put the blame on somebody else. So Dagny is a little beat up from her crash into this valley. She isn't really able to walk, so John Galt picks her up and carries her around, just showing her the splendor that is this great valley. Now, the major thing to note here is their symbol. Essentially, you can think of this as like a club. Their insignia is the dollar sign. So you got the S with the 2 slashes in it. This was the symbol that was ascribed into the mysterious cigarette that Dagny had from earlier, as well as the cigarette box right before she took off. So since she is an outsider, she kind of has to wait a month before she can ever go back into the real world, if she so chooses. However, the big problem is she's not ready to give up her railroad just yet. So during that month, she works as the housemaid of John Galt, where she kind of takes a little bit of a fancy to him. This part I find kind of crazy because during other parts of the book, it said that Dagny had feelings for one other industrialist. However, they're under the cover of being an idiot as well as super exuberant with money, so they could never really meet up. So she instead, as I mentioned in the last video, fell for Hank Reardon. But I guess now that he's out of the picture, she's falling in love with John Galt. Maybe this is a bit of Stockholm Syndrome? Well, whatever. The major things is that she is given the main philosophy of this valley, as well as introduced to several people that she honestly thought were dead. Take like Wyatt after he set fire to his oil refinery. After that month, she's led away. However, this valley has to be kept secret, so she is blindfolded. She comes back into the real world to find that, yeah, it's even worse of a mess than how she found it. So the main thing that happens after she gets back into the real world, as well as just kind of introducing us to what the new policies are with Taggart Transcontinental, is that there are 2 major meetings. So, the first one is by Hank Reardon. Now that the great congressmen and the lawmakers of this fictional America realize that he's important, they seem to be really interested in what he has to say at the meetings. However, nobody really seems to care what he's saying, but they just want him there to look good. Since he just basically has enough, and he leaves. However, it seems like a lot of people don't want him to leave. Well, what actually happens is that during this meeting they were planning to create the giant unification board. And what would be the justification of this? Disgruntled workers. Now, throughout this part of the book, there have been spies sent over to Reardon's steel mill to cause trouble and to make it seem like he is an awful boss, as well as just making him work under the worst conditions. However, the real employees are smart to this, and they are able to squash this little insurrection rather quickly, albeit at the cost of Reardon's Washington, D.C. contact. In fact, it was him that put out the alarm saying, "Hey, you shouldn't let these guys in here, they're going to cause a ruckus." So, this is the scene that Hank returns to when he leaves the meeting. There is a fire off in the distance, and there's the distant shouts and gunfire going on. However, the people inside the plant are able to hold off the thugs on the outside. After the rebellion is squashed, Hank Reardon goes to his office, where he basically says, "You know what? It's not worth it. I don't care anymore." And that is when one of the agents of John Galt comes by to persuade him to come into the valley. He listens intently, and then within a few days, he disappears, just like all the others. Now, there's a rather similar story that happens with Dagny. So now that she is literally the only one left, they really want her to be at the meetings. But just like Hank before, they have no interest in what she's saying at all. But they just want her to be there for publicity to make it look good. So she is invited to a press conference in order to proclaim how great this new policy is and that the country is doing better than ever. But obviously she couldn't bring herself to tell such a bold-faced lie. Now, mind you that this was a live broadcast on all television and radio channels. And right before this press conference is to go on, John Galt interrupts and gives the speech of the century. Now, I can forgive this book for a lot of things. I can forgive the idea that the author gets a little wordy at times. But this speech goes on for like 40 pages, and it's literally the same bits of philosophy that's been throughout the book. Now, it would probably be really inspiring to hear somebody give this speech in real life, but even according to the book, the speech lasts for like 3 hours. So if you ever get to this section of the book, basically just read maybe the first few paragraphs, and then if you've had enough, just skip to the next chapter and know that it was the speech of the century. Believe me, you are not missing out on anything. Now, after the famous speech, some of the congressmen think, this can be the man to solve our problems. Let's put the blame all on him, so that way we can look good. So there is a desperate search out to try to figure out where he is. While some people want him dead, others want him alive. In the end, it is Dagny that's able to find him. Basically, she's just had enough of wondering if he's alive, if he's dead, if he's in the valley, if he lives somewhere else. So, in an astonishing twist, it turns out that John Galt was on the Taggart transcontinental payroll. Now, this was a rather odd little twist. Essentially, Dagny's friend, Eddie, would often talk to this one person that would always eat in the cafeteria late at night. And later it's discovered that same man was John Galt. He was there the whole time, but yet nobody ever saw him and nobody ever knew about him. So she looks up the address and she quickly goes over to his house, which is the only remaining room left in probably the scummiest section of town. But I guess you gotta keep your cover. So they talk for a good half hour or so. Essentially, John Galt knows that Dagny was definitely followed, and that their plan is to hurry up and take him away to fix all their problems. However, there is a plan to ensure that everybody makes it out alive. So how do they do it? They make it seem like Dagny has lost faith in Galt's system and is in favor of the system that all the congressmen have. The charade is able to keep up for a little while. John Galt is being treated somewhat like a prisoner, but also like a guest. It's rather hard to describe. Essentially, he is put up in the fanciest hotel of the entire city, but yet he is under extreme watch and he's not allowed to leave. Every so often, congressmen and senators try to go in there to convince him to fix all his problems, but he's not having it. His general creed, I feel like I should probably read this to make sure I'm not misquoting it. I swear by my life and my love of it, that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. That is the basic philosophy, and that is the reason he refuses the turn to help save the country. Because obviously he'd be taken advantage of, just like all the other businessmen, and he wants to be independent. So they realize it's not going anywhere when one of the associates, a doctor, is well versed in the forms of torture. Apparently he's perfected a technique which has made it possible to solve very impossible crimes throughout the years. So they try to take him away. Dagny overhears this. Now, before Dagny hears all this, there is a small little letter from the valley basically saying, when you need us, call, and we will rescue John Galt. So, after she hears all this, she goes to the nearest phone booth, and the rescue operation begins. This is probably the most action-packed the book ever gets. Now, before they can get to him, they torture him with electricity. Now, since he is the inventor of the static motor, he knows all about this. There's a really funny scene here where basically the machine used to torture him goes down. Now, before this, he doesn't seem to be affected by the torture. Basically, they try to electrocute certain sections of the body, the arms, the legs, the chest, other areas like that. They'd put it up as high as possible, and while you can see the muscles convulse, he doesn't even scream. So just then, the machine breaks, and several of the senators and congressmen have gone mad. Basically, they want him to suffer. They want him to be indoctrinated with what they have been indoctrinated with. So they try their best to repair the machine. When I just love how, from the torture table, he just leans over and says, "Oh yeah, you gotta fix the right capacitor, shave off the aluminum, and then connect the 4-volt battery." But none of them know anything about electricity, so they don't know how to fix this. One of them has a mental breakdown. And while this is going on, they drag him by his feet out to the car as a way to try to bring sanity back to this poor man. Right before they leave, they shout at the structure, "We'll be back!" And this is when Dagny and the rescue operation swoops in, and they rescue him. After the rescue, they all head back to the valley, and the world pretty much ends. There's a very dramatic scene here that I think would just translate perfectly to cinema. Essentially, Eddie Wheeler, Dagny's best friend and assistant of Taggart Transcontinental, tried his best to get one of their major trains, known as the Comet, to start running again. However, without warning, the engine just stops. None of the engineers or anybody know how to start it back up again. While they're stranded, a traveling caravan comes by in what appears to be covered wagons and horses, and they offer all these people trapped on the train a ride. However, Eddie, just like the good captain, goes down with the ship. After several minutes of just realizing what just happened, the idea that the world has ended, trains are no longer going to be a thing, he then tries desperately to work on the motor of the engine to get it running again. But just like the congressman with the electrical torture device, he is unsuccessful. So he goes out into the Arizona desert to maybe see if perhaps the wheels are jammed. Just then, a jackrabbit comes by to see what's up. Eddie, being full of rage and just not really sure what to do right now, lunges for the jackrabbit, where it all of a sudden runs away. And that chapter ends with Eddie simply on his knees, bawling his eyes out, wondering why Dagny ever left. Now, the ending of the book reminds me a lot of the original animated Lorax, as well as the end of Digimon Season 3. Sure, they could have added a few more chapters to try to complete the story, but at the same time, it seems like this was a really good way to end it. While at the valley, everybody is enjoying their new life, when John Galt looks off into the distance and says, "It's time." And that is where the book ends. So there is this idea that there is hope for the country to be able to start back up again, but we never actually see if it happens. So then, now that I've actually finished this book, would I recommend it? Well, there are a few little bumps in the road I have to mention. For example, there are parts where the author kind of goes off on a tangent, writing a political essay and puts the story on hold. That is what makes me think a lot about George Orwell, because his writing is very similar. He tells an intense story, and then he breaks it to give a political essay. However, in this one, I'm pretty sure you could take John Galt's speech, and that could be a whole book or political essay by itself. Obviously, it's a very long book, very thick pages, but in all honesty, I was kind of surprised how the author could take such a mundane subject as the world of business, railroads, steelwork, and make it so fascinating. Now, the book itself is not really action-packed, so to speak. It's more like an old noir movie from the 40s, where it's more about the really good acting, the dialogue, and the intense contrast of colors. Very similar here. There is a little action here and there, but it's really more about the personality and the mentality of every single character. I could definitely say that this book would not be made today for a few reasons. First off is that, well, there's about 3 or 4 sex scenes, I mean, sometimes they get a little detailed, gets a little uncomfortable. But after reading The Spy Who Loved Me by Ian Fleming, I'm able to stomach sex scenes like this just fine. I mean, they seem kind of tame for the ones described in that book. Could actually kind of see it. But probably the major thing that's rather controversial about this book is its general theme. The idea that it's the people that have ability, for example, say a carpenter, that are taken advantage of by the people that don't have any ability. So, going with the carpenter scenario, it'd be a customer that's constantly complaining and wanting different woods while this carpenter is trying his best to get this to work just fine. That is kind of a conservative mentality, and anything conservative is gonna be controversial these days. So, if you think you can stomach the political views, stick it through to the end, I think you will find a rather fascinating book. The characters, the places, and the scenarios they are in, I think are just beautifully described. And in ways, I feel like this book is almost more relevant now than when it was when it first came out in 1957. Well, that is At the Shrugged. Till next time, keep having fun.